Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype and dig into what's real, what works, and what's backed by evidence. I'm Dr. AK. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back. This week we are talking about a passion project of mine. It is stress and all of the cool things that we have learned about stress. You may be saying, what are you talking about? Cool things about stress. There is nothing cool about stress. Well, I will tell you that is not true. So I didn't think this is something that you guys would be interested in hearing, but last night I went to this networking event and everyone at the table got to chit-chatting and stress came up, and I started sharing with them some of the things that we have learned about stress, and so moving forward, we shouldn't all think it's so terrible. People thought it was absolutely fascinating, and I thought, well, if that's the case, then we're going to talk about it here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about stress mindsets. What is a mindset? What are some updated physiologic responses to stress that we've learned about in the human body? What are some ways that we can control the physiology of how our body responds to stress? And then kind of what can you do moving forward when you are faced with your next stressful situation? This matters because, as you know, I do lifestyle medicine, and one of the pillars under lifestyle medicine is stress and how we cope with it or deal with it, or whatever word you want to use in terms of verbs and stress. We all have to have ways of addressing stress in our life because stress is unavoidable. So this fits in just beautifully to the lifestyle medicine pillar of stress. Once upon a time, I was an academic emergency medicine physician for like 20 years of that time. And I did a lot of research in burnout, physician wellness, and stress. And part of being an academic physician is that you need to do research and you need to travel around and give talks. And I was often invited to give talks about stress. And what I did in the beginning of every single one of the talks was I would have a slide up and I would say stress is ... The next slide was this word bubble where people would text in what they thought stress was. I asked them to finish that sentence, and you would see all these different words pop up on screen. And the things that would pop up were things like divorce, death, illness, financial bankruptcy, all bad stuff. And that is because the mindset around stress is that stress is bad. All right, let's shift to mindset now. I said stress mindset, so you need to know what a mindset is. A mindset is your personal set of thoughts and attitudes that influence your outlook on various situations. Academic nerd hat warning. Okay, so when I was getting a master in adult education, one of the things that we had to learn were all of the different adult educational theories. One of those theories is something called constructivism. The framework behind constructivism is that we learn through our experiences. We experience something. Oftentimes that experience will have some kind of emotion or feeling associated with it. We then have some kind of story or narration that we create with that. And then throughout our lives, each one of those events kind of builds upon each other and builds upon each other. Well, oftentimes those experiences formulate your mindset. That is basically the lens through which you are going to appraise and judge everything that happens in your life. We can have different mindsets about different things. When it comes to stress, the going mindset is that stress is bad. That is the collective thought that most of us feel when we are appraising stress. It is bad. There's a bunch of other stuff about mindsets that is absolutely fascinating, and if you want to learn more about it, I highly recommend a book called Mindset: The New Psychology of Success. Carol Dweck is the author. She was at Cornell. I have no idea where she is now. But I found the book very, very fascinating. And so if you want to learn more about mindsets, I would definitely read it. Going back to that stress mindset and thinking that stress is bad, well, there's a reason we all feel this way. And it's not necessarily because stress is bad. So let me share with you how we got to thinking stress is something terrible. This story goes back to the early 1900s. So one part of it is it was around 1930. There was a Hungarian endocrinologist by the name of Hans Salje who was conducting experiments on rats because he was trying to discover new female hormones. What he did was take various bovine mixtures, things like ovary and placenta, and he would mix them up and then he would inject the rats with them. He noticed that a lot of the rats would stop eating, they had decreased energy, and a lot of them would die. He began to wonder, as would any good scientist, is it this ovarian concoction from cows that I'm giving them, or is it what I'm doing to them? So he set up a study where he did the same thing, but he had two separate groups. He had the pureed cow ovary group, and then in the other group, he did saline. So everything he did between these two groups was exactly the same except for the product that he was injecting into the rats. He soon figured out that independent of what he injected into the rats, they had the same kind of physiologic consequences. He did necropsies on them, which are basically mini animal autopsies, and he found their brains were smaller, they had stomach ulcers, and just physiologically they were not doing so great. He wrote a couple papers about these rats and went through a few iterations until he finally landed on the term stress and said that these rats died because of stress. So that, my friend, is the first application of the term stress being linked with poor physiologic outcomes. It came from rats being injected with pureed cow ovary. It is 2026, and we are using a term and applying it in a similar way that was found in 1930s in rat studies. Just saying. The other part of stress being bad was around 1911 to 1915. There was another scientist, his name was Walter Cannon, and he was conducting experiments on animals that measured their adrenal response to different stimulants. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of what Walter Cannon's studies were like because it was basically animal torture and we don't need to talk about that. I will tell you that if these studies were attempted to be conducted today, I don't know any research review board that would say okay. But I will tell you very briefly in summary, well, I'll say it this way to give a good picture. It was basically animal Hunger Games. He put all these animals in a room for them to kill each other. He did other things too, but like I said, I'm not going to get into that. And then what he did was he would measure things like their heart rates, respiratory rates, cortisol levels, and he found that in these situations, all of those went up in animals. Their heart rates, their respiratory rate, their cortisol, all peaked. He then looked at the behavior of the animals and he noted that some of the animals were there to fight to the end, while others would kind of run away and go hide and cower. And guess what that gave rise to, my friends? That is where we got the fight or flight response. The assumptions that Salyer and Cannon found in these animal studies was then applied to human beings. And from then on, you had this huge body of literature that basically presented itself with a bias against stress. You had all these different studies that came out about humans, and they looked at stress and they looked to see what was really bad and how people got hurt. And this happened even though there were other really early research that was conducted demonstrating positive health outcomes from stress. Nobody wanted to hear it. They all wanted to talk about how stress was negative, and that is what the literature looked like for the next almost 100 years. So if you're one of the people that is like stress is bad, it is not your fault. It is based on a huge body of literature that started in the early 1900s and continued on until about 2000. This is where things start to get a little bit interesting. You may or may not be surprised to know that humans are a little bit more complex than rats, cats, and dogs. We have more than just a fight or flight response, and one of the first ones that we've learned about is a response called the tend and befriend response. This is an oxytocin-mediated response that comes from our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, when we talked about HRV, we talked about the two arms of our autonomic nervous system. You have the sympathetic, which is the one that kind of amps you up, and then the parasympathetic, that is the more chilled out version. So with the tend and befriend response, our heart rates come down, individuals feel less fear, circulating cortisol levels decrease, and all of this can lead to a faster recovery from a stressful event. So rather than prepare for battle, this is the exact opposite. This stress response is characterized by seeking out others for increased affiliation and coming together in groups during times of stress. Shelley Taylor was a psychologist who first discussed tend and befriend, and she found that although it is more common in women, this is something that is present in both sexes, and it is very driven by community. So smaller communities, when they experience different kinds of stressors together collectively as a community, they come together, they talk, and they have this oxytocin-mediated stress response. Humans also have another response called the challenge response. All right, bear with me. This is a hard word to say. So this is a dihydroepiandrosterone response, for short DHEA, which many of you may have heard of because it is a precursor to both estrogen and testosterone. So anyways, we have the challenge response, which is DHEA mediated, and it actually buffers against the physiologic responses that are mediated by cortisol. And don't get me wrong, we need to have physiologic responses that are mediated by cortisol. In order for our species to survive, we need the fight or flight, and that's why so many different species that are out there respond with fight or flight. But what I'm trying to say is humans are more complicated, and we have these other stress responses that nobody ever talked about until recently, because up until now, we just thought stress was bad. But look at these two responses that you have. One brings communities together and one helps you overcome challenges. That's huge. Another huge thing that we've learned is that we can actually control our physiological outcomes when it comes to stress. We have to go back in time for this one a little bit too. In the late 1970s, this study came out called the Framingham study. It was a huge study where they looked at cardiovascular events in humans and tried to figure out, well, what causes them. You may have heard type A people have more coronary events. That is a super oversimplification that came from the original Framingham study. But here's the thing, we revisited the data in the Framingham study and we learned that that was not actually the case. So what the Framingham study initially said that were people who have high levels of perceived stress ended up having a higher incidence of cardiovascular events. But when you go back and you look at the data, it wasn't the fact that people had high levels of perceived stress. It was people who had high levels of perceived stress and thought the stress was bad for them. Those are the ones who had a higher incidence of cardiovascular events. Well, when people read this, they're like, yeah, no, that's crazy. So another study was done. It was published in the Journal of Health Psychology in September of 2012. The name of the study is Does the Perception That Stress Affects Health Matter? The Association with Health and Mortality. That study confirmed the secondary analysis of the Framingham study. Researchers followed individuals for 8 years and demonstrated those who stated they experienced high levels of stress and felt that the stress had negative health consequences had an increased risk of premature death. That is crazy. It's not just if you experience high levels of stress. It's if you experience these high levels of stress and you believe it is unhealthy, that's when you experience these negative health consequences. And you might be thinking like, well, great, I think stress is bad and unhealthy, and so now I'm going to have all of these things happen to us. Hold on. You need to know about the research of someone by the name of Aaliyah Crum. Remember when I talked about Carol Dweck in the very beginning and we talked about that mindset book? Well, Aaliyah Crum was her protege, and Aaliyah Crum has spent most of her professional career looking at mindset interventions, and it just so happened that she did one on stress, which was pretty fascinating. Most of you listening are around my age, so you are going to remember in 2008 when we had this huge financial collapse. All these businesses and companies in Wall Street were doing these huge layoffs. It just so happens that Crum and her crew walked into one of these businesses. They never revealed who, because I'm sure it was like a confidentiality thing. But that company had told all of their employees, we are going to be laying off a whole bunch of you. Stressful, right? Crum comes in with her team, and they've separated participants into 3 separate groups. One was a group that got all of this education on all of the positive effects of stress. So some of the research that I have shared with you that we've talked about, a whole bunch of other stuff too, but it was a series of videos that people were shown. The other group was shown kind of the normal stuff that we've come to believe all of these years about this negative narrative of stress, right? It's bad for you, and she showed all those videos. And then the third group was a control group who didn't really receive any kind of intervention. What they found was the group that received the videos that stress is beneficial ended up increasing their engagement with their work. They looked at employee engagement scores and their scores went up. They knew they were getting laid off. That had nothing to do with it. Their engagement scores went up when they learned all of this good education about stress. The other thing that happened was their levels of perceived stress went down. The exact opposite happened with the group that got the videos of how bad stress is, and then nothing changed for the people that didn't have any kind of intervention at all. Not only have we learned that humans have more than just fight or flight, but we've learned that humans can control how their bodies respond to stress based on what they believe about stress, and humans can change their mind about what they believe about stress. You might be asking, why on earth are you telling us all of this? And I'm going to respond with, well, this is because it's an area that I work on with my patients, and it's relevant. If you are presented in a high stress situation where your life is on the line, by all means, go full fight or flight. However, if you are faced with an issue at work or you're dealing with something at home, you don't need to go full fight or flight. You don't need to go from 0 to a cortisol-mediated stress response. You can pause and choose to go down an oxytocin-mediated path or a DHEA-mediated path. All the oxytocin-mediated path requires you to do is sit down and talk with some people. I always recommend that everybody have a personal board of directors. This is what I do. I'm not a BFF kind of gal, but I do have a group of people in my life who I lean on whenever there are certain things that happen. And I may talk to different people about different issues, but I go down this tend and befriend route with them. You can also choose to go down a DHEA-mediated path, that whole challenge response. A challenge response is more likely to occur when individuals have resources available to address the situations that threaten a goal or whatever is personally relevant, right? So the stress arises when you care about something, and then whatever it is that you care about has some kind of challenge or barrier to it. If you pause for a second and step back and appraise the entire situation, oftentimes you'll see what resources are available to overcome whatever that threat is. That is how you select a DHEA-mediated response. I'm going to be honest with you, it takes time to be able to do this. One of the first things you need to do is almost do like a scan of your body whenever you're experiencing stress so that you can learn what is it that your body does. Then in the future, when you feel that your body's doing this, that's like a red flag that your body's waving, like, hey, I'm feeling stress. And that is your time to pause. Don't go down the route of fight or flight. Just pause, take a breath, think about what it is that you're facing in that situation, and then you can objectively choose a different pathway to go down to deal with whatever the stressor is that you're being faced with. The other part of that is realize that this stress is not harmful to you. All of those increased mortalities and increased events that happen with chronic disease as they relate to stress are often due to how someone appraises that stress in terms of whether it's good or bad. Again, a lot of this stuff takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and I do a lot of one-on-one work with my patients when their stress scores are through the roof and they are really struggling with how they're going to address stress in their life. So I have zero expectation that you're going to listen to this podcast and be an amazing expert on the topic. However, if you are interested, there is a book you can read that I love. It's called The Upside of Stress. It's from Kelly McGonigal. She's the author. She goes into great detail about some of the things that I talked about and talks about a whole other body of literature that we didn't even come close to touching today. There's only so much that I'm going to cover if I want to keep things short and sweet. So if you're interested in learning more, make sure to check out that book, and I will talk to all of you next week. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's No Filter Doctor. If you enjoyed the content, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also go to www.thewholehumanhealthandwellbeing.com and sign up for the weekly newsletter, where you will get a link to the blog, that week's podcast, and a health tip of the week sent directly to you. It's important to know that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it's not intended as medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The information discussed should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should it replace individualized medical care. If you have questions or concerns about your health, please contact your own healthcare provider. Any decisions to delay or forego a medical evaluation or treatment based on the information discussed in this podcast are made so at your own risk. My only financial disclosure is my medical practice, The Whole Human Health and Wellbeing. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.